Meet me at the Musial with Alan and Daniel. We'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. Everyone come gather round, listen to your favorite sound. We'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. We'll talk the games and all the rest, about the team that we love best. We'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. We're gonna talk about the Cardinals all night long.
Good evening and welcome into another edition of Meet Me at Musial. I'm your host, Daniel Shopta at C70 on the Twitter X thing. I told you last week that I was going to have a little segment with Alan about his high school baseball team, but Alan and I did not make connections this week. Both of us kind of forgot that Wednesday was Valentine's Day and we probably shouldn't record on that day, so we didn't. We'll get to that next week. Sitting in Alan's chair, metaphorically speaking, this week we've got Jason Hill from Viva El Birdos. You and I have had JP Hill Cards on the Twitters. Jason, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, man. How are you doing?
Doing well. Always good to have you on. And before we get into Cardinals stuff, do want to point out again, you're writing a VEB on the regular, and you're running the podcast over there as well. How much fun has that been for you? I know y'all have kind of picked up the podcast in the last year, especially, probably a little bit more actively. Has it been, found that to be a lot of fun?
It has been. It's been a blast. Really, I do writing, but my background is in video editing and audio stuff, and so it was kind of like, coming back to my roots a little bit. And when I first started on at Viva El Birdos about 3 years ago, I mentioned that to our then site manager, and she was like, "Yeah, you should do that sometime." And I was just a newbie, just getting my feet wet, didn't want to like jump out with something creative, and so it took me a couple of years to get around to it. But yeah, once we did, it's been a joy and a lot of fun having our writers on there, but then also having the opportunity to interview players, mostly from the minor leagues, but players who have now gone on to become major leaguers, and fun talking to them and hearing from them, and getting to do that a little bit has been surprising and enjoyable.
Yeah, and then I was able to use your show as, show prep for myself, because you all had Dane Perry on about a week before I did. So
I saw that. Yes, I did that on purpose. I saw your schedule. I was like, oh, I've got to get Dane first. Well, no, we did have a gap there, so he was the perfect guy to fill it. He's great.
Yeah, really good. We enjoyed our conversation last week as well. It's spring training. We've gotten there, and as a person who is with the religious background that you have, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but I've often considered...
we can get deep into the weeds with that if you want to, as deep as you want to go, man.
You and I could. I don't know that. I think by that time, we're going to have a lot of clicking off. Maybe
we would have three listeners. 3 listeners is all that would be left.
That's right. But have you, I assume you've had the same thoughts then. We had Ash Wednesday on the same day as pitchers and catchers. Lent and spring training kind of have this overlap. And it's a really an interesting thing to see from our point of view as you go into both of those seasons.
Yeah, it kind of is. I mean, I could dig into the theology of that if you want me to. I mean, totally geek out on your listeners, because on one sense, like, Lent is supposed to be a season of sacrifice and not like a downer season, but you're giving things up. You're letting things go. It's a season of repentance in anticipation of Easter that's coming, right? The rising again from the ashes, so to speak. But here you've got that juxtaposed against spring, which is in my mind, just such a happy time, such a pleasant time. There's snow here in Missouri where we are, but yet there's our guys down there in Jupiter playing catch in the sun, and it's an interesting juxtaposition, but it makes for a fun time of year.
Yeah, I talked about it a little bit on the Substack this week. Again, that time, and less so, back in the old days when people went into spring training, they actually had to, like, get into shape. They had to have that discipline and all that kind of stuff. These guys now, except for the pitchers, they could probably walk into a major league game and play like tomorrow. Just the way they are. So, but it's interesting, and again, the new leaf, the new life, if you will. of the baseball season. However, it doesn't, it's not a complete, we like to say it's a fresh slate. It's completely new. It's not completely new, right? I mean, it's still influenced by what happened last year.
Right.
And we're getting a little bit of that, especially today. It's kind of late, and I want to start with this because it is kind of fresh. Jeff Jones got a chance to talk to Nolan Arenado, and we've heard a lot about clubhouse culture and all that kind of stuff. And Nolan put out a quote. I guess I should probably read it for anybody that hasn't seen it. I know you've mentioned it, so I'll read this and I'll let you talk about your thoughts. But let's see. Nolan says, our team was just all young guys. And I don't mean this in a bad way, but they kind of overran the clubhouse. And it's usually the veterans who run the clubhouse. And I don't mean that in a way that they were disrespectful. It wasn't anything like that. There were just so many of them. And I think that if you want to get the best out of young guys, they've got to see how the veterans do it. All-stars and players that have been there before. And that's how you get them better. But if they don't have those kind of figures, it's hard for that to happen. I know me and Goldie were there, but we're not really vocal people either. So it's nice to have Carp, who's not afraid to go up to people and talk to them and hold them accountable. When you read this, what were your first thoughts?
Well, the thing is that I had a really busy day in the office today. And so, to be honest, I ran across the reaction to it before I ran across the actual quotes.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that probably colored a little bit of the way that I looked at it. But, to me, it's not surprising that Arenado would come out here and sort of, shoot from the hip a little bit. Like he hasn't been one who has shied away from telling things kind of the way they are and speaking his mind. He doesn't always do it, but whenever he feels like it's necessary, he takes that opportunity. And I don't know what was happening in the clubhouse last year. I can't speak to the environment. I don't know that it was good or bad. I know, as do all of us, that the results on the field weren't good. And clearly these guys, both Goldie and Arenado, and also John Mozeliak and Ollie Marmol, seem to think that it was a real issue. So I think in many ways what you're seeing is Arenado reflecting something that's been talked about probably in extensive detail within the clubhouse and within their, the players' text chain that they've talked about. And he's just sort of verbalizing what they've all known and talked about for a while, but hasn't really been out in the media. And so here we have this statement, and fans who have been looking for information for a long time finally have something to react to. And, not everyone is reacting to it in a positive way. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I think there's definitely different ways to look about this. I will say when I was reading that, it almost sounded like there was this infestation of young guys in the clubhouse,
Yeah.
And they needed to kind of, call a fumigator or something of that nature. And I don't know that that's what he meant, but it is kind of interesting to think about the fact that this clubhouse, I mean, we see turnover, but especially in the hitting side of things,
yeah,
it's a lot of the same guys, right? I mean, it's a lot of the same people that, in theory, weren't getting that leadership that they needed. So I guess, in that regard, Carp is coming in. But I mean, do you think, I mean, again, you said, they've probably talked about this before, but if they haven't, does this come across like hard on guys? Like if Jordan Walker's reading this, if Mason Wentz, Brendan Donovan, any of those young guys, do you think it comes across to them as like, what's Nolan really getting at here?
Yeah, I think it would. I'm not sure that's a bad thing, necessarily, because I don't think that Nolan would be saying it, and I don't think that Goldie hasn't spoken, but Mozeliak and the way that he's talked about it, I don't think that they would be talking about this way if it wasn't actually a problem, or if there wasn't things going on. And I can't say that it was Jordan Walker or Mason Wynn or Dylan Carlson or anyone. I have no idea. But if there were issues, it needs to be addressed. And sometimes those things just have to be recognized for what they are and spoken for what they are. And I don't think Nolan, he didn't call anyone out. He kind of threw, in one sense, I was interacting with iPop Editor on Twitter a little bit. He made some good points. I'll let him repeat those on Sunday night. But but he did kind of throw like everyone under the bus, but then also kind of threw himself under there too, which I think is highly appropriate in a season where they won 71 games. Everyone's under the bus. So
Right.
figure out the way out. And I think in some ways that's what you're seeing here with Arenado. He recognized the problem. He didn't do everything that he maybe could have done to solve it. Maybe he's not equipped to solve it. And so this is their solution, not just Carpenter, but their whole approach to clubhouse environment, towards veterans to go along with their critical young players. And from there, seeing if that will help, the environment get a little bit better this year.
I think it's also I think it's probably pretty telling that, when we talk about a clubhouse that is having problems, we're often talking about, personality conflicts or, people that are just, not bad apples, if you will, or whatever the case may be. The Cardinals didn't really, clear out a lot of those guys, right? Tyler
Yeah.
O'Neill went to Boston, and maybe that was part of that. Who knows? Rich Palacios goes to Tampa Bay, but we're pretty sure that, everybody's talking about how upbeat he was. It didn't really seem to be an issue. So, it's not an unsolvable problem. It's just almost like you're not doing it the way we want you to, but
Yeah.
you're not doing it wrong either.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of it goes back probably, I'm sure, to things like game preparation, maybe not study habits, but the way you study, the way you learn pitchers, the way you handle batting practice, what you do on the side. I mean, there's certain procedures and certain activities that veterans have sort of put in place, habits, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
that young guys probably are trying to make that up on the fly, or they have to be shown it. And how much of an impact those things have on the field, I can't say, but the veterans seem to think that it does. And so if they have more people that are able to teach those things, work on those things, then I think they feel they're going to get a better product of it. And like you said, I don't think it necessarily has to do with conflicts and personality issues and arguing or this or that. It's more about how they handle the day-to-day business and setting an example in the right ways for kids that maybe just literally have never seen things done the way that Yadier Molina did it, or seen things done the way that Albert Pujols did it. Now, some of them have, but some of the guys, haven't either. So,
Well, and there's also the idea of seeing what they're doing, but not completely understanding it. Like,
yeah,
again, we know Chris Carpenter started this idea of everybody on the pitching staff watching the bullpen of the starter for that day, right? I mean,
right,
this idea, and there was reasons for that. Besides team camaraderie to learn to critique, it's been a while since Carpenter's been there, and now Wainwright's gone and stuff like that. It's very easy to get to the point of, hey, I know we're supposed to be out here, but what are we doing? I mean, are we just,
yeah.
standing here and we'll mess with our phones and stuff like that and kind of shoot the breeze while this guy's throwing instead of, using that as a time to get intentionally better. And, again, it's some of that, this is why we do that. And you got to have people that know why you're doing it to be there.
Right. I think maybe we saw, I can't say that this is exactly what Arenado was talking about, but we might have seen an example of this at winter warm-up, because Alec Burleson came to winter warm-up and talked about some of the things that he recognized and realized during the season, that just because he had done things a certain way and those things had carried him to the majors didn't mean that he was going to be able to continue to do that. And so in the off season, he worked on his diet, he changed what he ate, he worked on his workout process, started working a lot more on outfield defense and things that we recognized and saw in him, but things that weren't necessarily what he needed to get to the majors. And it's that kind of thing that some of those everyday things, from your diet to your workout habits to your eating to your rest schedule, that coaches can talk about maybe, and different people have different routines, but it's probably the veterans in the clubhouse that are really enforcing that and sparking that kind of desire to follow the line, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
in the youngsters who maybe had never even thought about it or realized it, or maybe were so bought into what got them there that they're not familiar with what they need to do to get them even farther.
And now there's a fine line too, because you don't want these players to kind of come off as, just Jordan Walker, Mason Wynn. We've got, Victor Scott too, probably coming in a year or so, or maybe even less. There's a personality that infuses that, frankly is a little bit against the Cardinal way to some degree. We're not
Yeah.
necessarily used to that kind
Yeah.
of excitement or youthful exuberance, and so you don't want the leadership of the veterans to crush that, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you want
Right.
them to channel it more than anything, and that's a difficult thing to do, especially in a situation where, like, especially Nolan and Goldie may not be those kind of leaders. They're more of the, we're going to go out here and show you how it's done. We're not necessarily going to talk to you. That can be a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a great example because Goldie is I'm sure a great visual leader, a great example in what he does. The guy clearly works hard and has an impeccable work ethic and behaviors and habits and everything. But he just rarely talks at all. Rarely talks about, to the media, rarely talks in public. It's just not who he is. He's a quiet kind of guy. And you don't want to turn Mason Wynn and Jordan Walker into Goldschmidts in terms of personality, but if they were Goldschmidt in terms of their habits while having all of that personality, they're going to be great players. And I think that's what everyone's looking for, is turning great personalities and great players into players that can sustain that over the long haul and become what they're supposed to be at the major league level.
I just think about the Cardinals put out a video this week of the players. It's like, it's time. It's time to turn the page. Blah blah blah, and it's got Walker and it's got Michaelis, and then it's got Goldschmidt in there, and he is like almost stone faced while he's reciting whatever line that he has to say. Like, I don't really want to be here. Don't put me in this situation. But I mean, that's people are like that, and I think that's. I think a lot of places have talked about this in this offseason, is just because you've got a really good player, a really excellent player, does not mean that he's the people person that can be that leader. Sometimes he's a really great player because he is so dedicated and focused on himself that all he can do is lead by example, because he doesn't have the bandwidth to help somebody else out as well.
Right. Right. And also there's different types of leadership and different ways that people lead. And Goldie's not going to become Mr. Yadier Molina speech guy or doing bat flips, like Ozzie Smith and being such a dynamic personality. He's just going to be who he is. And who he is can set a great example for the young players, but he also can't be who he isn't. It's just not going to work for him. And so, you got to bring someone in like Carp, who apparently can do that. I guess, they seem to think that he can, and hopefully it'll help, because I don't know how much they're going to get from him with his bat. So if they get something from him in the clubhouse, it would be a net positive, I suppose.
I mean, we'll have to wait and see. It might have to be a lot of good stuff in the clubhouse to be a net positive. We'll just have to see how many times he's used in what situations.
Well, the more time that he spends on the bench and not hitting, the more time he can lead from the bench. That's my take on it. So
I think that's safe, and I think that's what everybody else wants to see as well. And hopefully that's the case. I mean, I feel like I trust Ollie Marmol to be more judicious with Matt Carpenter than Mike Matheny or Mike Schilt was. I think Ollie has. I mean, besides the fact that Carp has been gone for a couple of years, and that helps break the mystique, if you will. I just feel like we saw a little bit of that, not as much with Yachty, but because Yachty was hurt. But I felt like Ollie at times was much more likely to, this is what the numbers say, you're not playing, versus, hey, we're going to let you play because if you play long enough, maybe you'll hit something.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we saw it some with Molina. And the thing with Molina, when he was struggling so poorly, it's not that Kisner, that wasn't Kisner's great offensive. Well, great's a relative term, but it wasn't Kisner's best offensive season either. Like, he was struggling too. So the difference between the two players wasn't really all that significant. And so why not go for the guy who can really call a game and has the pedigree and all that stuff. Now, early on in the season with Pujols, before he really started on his home run tear, I thought that Ollie was giving him too much run. And back then, to be honest, I can't remember all the circumstances, and time kind of erased that either. But if Ollie was seeing the Pujols that we saw later in the year in batting practice and in other places, I can't blame him at all for throwing him out there, because it by the time June rolled around, he was an unstoppable force. So how could you criticize Ollie for that? So it seems like, that that he probably is better equipped for that than Matheny was, and probably more so than Schilt. And this will be a good test of that.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah, I mean, yeah, Pujols played quite a bit. I'll kind of pull up his game log. It does. Um, he probably did play maybe a little bit more than he needed to, but it got him
Yeah.
out there on the mound, and that's okay. So
Yeah, yeah, right,
you know,
exactly.
so we've gotten 20 minutes into this podcast, and we haven't talked into your wheelhouse of payroll yet.
Oh
So
yeah,
we've got
let's
to
do that. Just far
adjust
enough
that.
into it that people, if they're either committed to it or they're willing to be bored today, so
Yeah,
we
yeah. I
can go
mean,
payroll.
they've tuned out. They're doing something else in the background, with us in the
Yeah.
background. So just trying to get through it. We went into this off season, a lot of us, and you've done more work on this than probably anybody outside of the Cardinal organization. Um, and I think all of us kind of expected a certain level, and I think most of us would say they didn't reach that level. Is that a fair assessment, or did we just expect way too much out of them?
Well, I thought it was fair at the time, based on the information that I had. And I've written 3 or 4 articles. Probably the first one I wrote was back in October, and then probably about once a month or so, I would bring out another one as more information rolled out. But based on what we were hearing early in the off season, it did seem like something like a $205 million final payroll was reasonable, and that if you start counting backwards from there, leaving enough space for signings and a 40-man roster bump and stuff like that. See, what I do is Daniel, you know this, but for the listeners who might not, what I do is I only project a 26-man opening day payroll. And I know from an accounting perspective, that's not the way that the Cardinals do things. So let me just make sure that's clear. The Cardinals do not do things this way. But my purpose is to inform off-season conversations so that we don't get these things like, oh, they should sign David Price and Bryce Harper and whoever and spend $100 million. I want to give people a pretty good idea of what the Cardinals are likely to spend so that our off-season conversations as a community can be relatively accurate. That's my whole goal. That's all I'm after. And so 26-man payroll removes all those benefits, all those health insurance costs, all of those, payments and fees that MLB has to throw into a pot. It just takes all of that out, and you're just dealing with player salaries. So your final 40-man end of the year payroll is always going to be higher than what it is on opening day. And so depending on how you work, now the Cardinals are almost always talking about final 40-man end of season payroll, and usually luxury tax payroll, which includes a whole bunch of other factors that have been really frustrating to people this year. But opening day payroll, it's always going to be smaller than that, and the gap is somewhere between 10 and 20 million in an average year. So I started working back from the idea of about a $205 million payroll. I got myself to 192 is what I thought the Cardinals would probably put forward as their opening day payroll this year. And I was off by $20 million. So, based on the information that they gave us, I thought that I made sound decisions and sort of made a reasonable projection. Everyone always tells me that I'm too low. But every year that I've done this while on the side, I've been too high, but not this much. So based on my previous way of operating, I thought I was going to be close, maybe a little bit high. And the Cardinals just did something completely different than what we expected.
How much of that do you think was a plan to spend less, even though, again, not necessarily telling everybody that? And how much of that was, okay, we wound up getting Lance Lynn and Kyle Gibson for cheaper than we thought, and so we're not going to have to spend X amount of money on pitching like we thought, so we'll just, we're pretty good. We don't have to worry about it, and go on from there. Like, did they really have the intent to spend that and wound up not having to? Or do you think they were always kind of focused on, let's keep it realistic?
Daniel, I don't know. And here's why I don't know. Because I believed John Denton and Bill DeWitt the third whenever he said that they were up against their payroll wall. And that was back right before the winter warm-up. And since then, they signed Middleton for a $5 million contract, signed Carpenter for a league minimum, $740K,
Right.
and then also traded for Kittredge, who was I think I've got him at 2.26. So that's when they said they were up against a payroll wall. They've added about $8 million. Well, that's not a significant amount, but it would have pushed them past what I presumed was their wall. So again, I can't answer your question as accurately as I would like, because on one hand, they said they were up against a wall and then they still spent, right? And now we've heard some talk about how they've still got space in their payroll for, your typical trade deadline additions and things like that. So I don't know, Daniel. I really don't know. I think part of it was that they were able to get Lynn and Gibson for very reasonable rates early in the offseason, and that kept them from having to spend more. And I think the Bally situation might have been a factor. We heard that at various times from various parts of club representatives, and then heard the opposite a couple days later. So it's just been a mess. Their communication on this has just been a mess. And have they done what they said they would do by their players? Probably so. Not to the quality that we expected, but they did get 3 starters, and they've brought in at least 2, legit major league caliber relievers. They've totally overhauled their bullpen depth, which has been an excellent thing. But I still am coming away with it a little bit disappointed based on their spending and what they said early in the off season.
Yeah, and it doesn't. I mean, again, we sit here today. Blake Snell's still out there. Jordan Montgomery's still out there. Guys that, if you don't sign both Lynn and Gibson, maybe you could even take a run at.
Yeah.
But it just really does feel like, and we've talked about this in a couple of shows, they're ready to have, especially in the pitching side, a reset pretty soon, because, a lot of 1-year deals, Sonny Gray's a 3-year with an option. But everybody in that, in a couple of years, everybody on this team could be gone, right?
Yeah.
So, and then they're going to have to buy or develop this pitching anyway. So, I don't know. It's very, very interesting the way they went about that. And you do wonder if they went for Gibson and Lynn because of the cost certainty and not having to stretch them out for 5 years like you would. Because there's no way you're getting Jordan. Even right now, you're not getting a Jordan, Montgomery, or Snell on a 1-year deal, do you think?
I don't know. I don't think so. We've talked a little bit about this on the site in some of our chats and comments, and I can't help but think back to like previous seasons way back in the day. We're not that old, but we're old. Kyle Loesch coming in sort of, right. I can't remember when Loesch signed, late February, March, that kind of time frame.
Yeah, it was in spring training. Yeah.
It was in spring training. Yeah. And so Loesch, you were able to get him on a 1-year sort of pillow deal. And so that experience and some others like that in the past makes me think that 1-year deal is possible for a guy like Montgomery. But I've got to think that Boris has at least 3 or 4-year deals on the table for a guy like Montgomery or Snell. Mm-hmm. And for some reason they're still holding out. So I kind of think that the longer it goes, the more that a short-term deal is possible. But I don't think I'm there yet. I think it's going to be another 2 or 3 weeks before I really think that something like that is likely.
Yeah. I think that's. I think that it gets to a point that obviously Scott Boras doesn't want to back down, but I also got to think that Jordan Montgomery and Blake Snell don't want to start the season on the bench either.
Yeah.
I mean,
as much as we criticize Boras and talk about Boras, I mean, there's a reason why all these players take him as his agent. He gets the job done in the end. Might not be the way that any of us expect, but it usually happens. And so they probably have some reason, at least, to still have confidence in his procedure.
Yeah, I mean, he tends to know what the market is, right? I mean, because maybe that's because he's often setting it. I don't know, but he doesn't usually misread it terribly badly. And right now, I mean, to be fair, it does kind of look like he's either overplayed his hand, but yeah, we'll see. I know a lot of people say, the Orioles have had an injury already, and you think, oh, you're calling Montgomery, but again, if he's not ready to sign a 1-year deal, an injury doesn't really help you any, right? I mean, because you get a guy that goes down, even with Tommy John, he's coming back next year. You don't go out and sign necessarily Jordan Montgomery for a 4-year deal right then.
Right. Yeah. Although I think the Cardinals are in a position where they could, going back to kind of what you're saying, like looking at the roster resources over on Fangraphs and their long-term payroll, you mentioned Gray, he's here for 3 years. Mikolas is, they've got him under control for 2 this year and next year. And Gibson, there's a 1-year option. Lynn, there's a 1-year option. Matz has 2 years. I mean, by 2026, we've got a one-man rotation.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought this was the beginning of the offseason. I still think it now. It's very possible, very easy for them to add a longer term commitment for, either for a hitter or a pitcher. A pitcher makes way more sense. They sort of did it with Gray. They could have done it another 2 or 3 times and not really stretch their future payroll that much. But for some reason, they've chosen to go short term. And it makes me a little bit nervous about what their future rotation will be like. And it puts a lot of strain on their development system, but that's also where they want that strain to be. They want to be a draft and development team that can develop pitchers. And so they're providing themselves with the opportunity to do it, I suppose.
Well, and it's not been, I know it seems like it, but it's not been that long ago since that's what the Cardinals were, right? They couldn't develop hitters, but they had pitchers coming from every which way.
Yeah, I had a long-term series of articles called "The Cardinals Are a Pitcher Factory," and every year I went through the list of starters that were just right there on the verge, waiting to take their turn.
Yep, and then the Cardinals started trading them off, and the reason again you make as much as they hurt now. The Gallen trade, with Alcantara and all that kind of stuff, is because there were so many pitchers in the organization, and you had to clear out some of them, and you just picked the wrong ones to clear out.
That's what happened.
Yeah, unfortunately. And I've asked the last couple of weeks, we've talked about this situation, so I'll ask you as well. Do you think it is the Cardinals are looking forward and saying, okay, we know Bally's is here this year. This Amazon situation is going to be interesting. They might be around another few years. We may have to pivot to direct to customer, which is going to be pretty good for the Cardinals, I think, in general, because of how proud they are. But they also don't know how that's going to affect markets overall. If everybody in baseball is going to have to, if the money's lessened overall, maybe they feel they can get good pitchers at cheaper prices, and so they don't want to commit themselves.
Yeah.
Or is it Mo's done in another year, and they want as few commitments as possible for the new guy when he comes in, whoever that guy may be.
Yeah, I think that's too. I think that it might be one of those situations where there's 4 or 5 answers, but not one answer. Mm-hmm. And I think that Bally plays a role in it. One of the things that I've thought about that I think maybe we talked about with Dane, and I can't remember whether you guys talked about it on your podcast, although I know you guys talked about the Bally situation a little bit, is that revenue from TV, if I remember right, now correct me if I'm wrong, Daniel, because I haven't looked into this as much as I should have. But a certain percentage of TV revenue goes into the pot, goes into the pool. And that gets shared to some degree throughout all of baseball. And so while the Cardinals might remain in a strong position by going to a direct to consumer product, by streaming their broadcasts themselves, starting their own network, that doesn't mean that, say, the Royals or the Diamondbacks or the Rangers or the Twins are also going to be in a beneficial situation. And so, like you're kind of getting at, revenue, even if the Cardinals sort of stay fairly strong because of their loyal viewership base, that doesn't mean that that's going to be the case all over baseball, which could lead to a decline in revenue for the Cardinals and a decline of revenue for everyone else. Now, as you point out, which I think was an excellent point, that could lead to a depression of salaries as well, making it a little easier to sign some of these guys down the road. And that could be something that they're factoring in. But I think the fact that there's so many unknowns, even though I feel like they're in a beneficial position, so many unknowns is keeping them from wanting to buy into their future. And instead, they're just sort of letting things play out and see who develops and see what happens internally, and we'll react to it, later.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, the Cardinals are really good about kicking cans. I think we
They
know
are.
that. I mean,
They've got
we just
several world championships in kicking cans.
we've seen quite a bit of that, and so yeah, I feel like I would be a little bit more confident in that approach if the pitching side had at least somebody coming up, right? I mean, we know that the
Yeah.
Cardinals have gotten out and got some people at the trade deadline last year, and they're pitchers that are going to help this team. I think I don't think anybody really questions that too much, but it's still not. If in 2 years, 3 years, you've got a rotation that is, Sonny Gray followed up by Takeo Roby and Adam Kloffenstein and some reverse and Zach Thompson, I don't know that we feel real confident about that.
Yeah. Is that a championship caliber rotation? I
Right.
don't know. Yeah.
Um, and I mean, and again, if we don't feel bad about the offense, seems right. I mean, we feel pretty good
Yeah.
about that. A lot of young guys, a lot of guys that are, even a couple of guys in Sagase and Scott that are coming up that that have at least a chance to contribute. You've got a little bit of that. What's coming up. You got depth there of quality depth.
Yeah.
It just whether they can develop that on the pitching side is again a question that we've had for a long time.
Yeah, I think it's a great example, and I think they're hitting the way that they've succeeded with their hitting development speaks into this because despite being what I would say is ridiculously successful with their hitting development over the last few years with Gorman and Donovan and another Newt Bar. I mean, they've really hit on some players with this. Even with that, this team will still rise and fall based on Paul Goldschmidt and Nolan Arenado, right? So
Right.
so even when you've done as great a job as as a system is likely to do in your hitting development, you're still reliant on these superstar level producers. Now maybe Jordan Walker becomes that, maybe Mason Wynn becomes that. Uh, you know, maybe, right? It's possible, but you're going to need a couple of those hits. Now, you look at the pitching staff, and yeah, they've got probably maybe as many as 5 or 6 arms that could be legitimate major league starters, ranging from Takeo Roby and Tink Hintz at the top to, I mean, maybe the bottom of my list would be like Simmer Bursa or, Kloffenstein maybe has a chance to be an actual starter, but not a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Probably, right? So there's probably 7 or 8 names in there. Gordon Graceffo, Cooper Jerpy, you can name a couple other guys, but besides maybe Hintz and Roby, and they don't really project as number ones, they're more number 2, number 3 kind of arms. That top side isn't there. It just isn't there. And so yeah, you could reinforce your rotation with more mid-level guys, number 3s, number 4s, number 5s, but it still takes those high producers, those elite teams to really take you over the top, not just to be a championship caliber team, but just to be a playoff caliber team. That's what it takes. And I don't really see a lot of that in the Cardinals system. And so they're going to have to spend, and they're going to have to bring in players, and it's going to have to be, a challenge for them going forward that their system's just not going to provide.
Yeah. Now they do have the opportunity, obviously, in this draft with the high picks
Yeah.
to maybe at least, especially in the first round, get a fast rising top of the rotation type of guy. But there's also no guarantee that that's going to work either.
Yeah. Well, and
when
even
they're
like you say, a fast riser, and that's where it becomes difficult because your fast risers are typically your college arms, and
Mhm.
your college arms can be high impact, but they tend to be a little bit more like your number 2, number 3 caliber guy. Depends on who it is. It's those high school arms, that have that elite upside, and they're not going to develop in 2 years. It's going to be a 4 or
Right.
5 year project.
Well, and then and again, you have so much more variance there too. I mean,
Yeah.
we've talked about Tink Hintz, and yeah,
Yeah.
there's still a good chance of Tink Hintz becoming, maybe a 2 or 3. But reading in Keith Law's write ups at the Athletic, there's also that possibility he becomes, shifts into maybe a top notch reliever,
Yeah.
which especially in the Cardinal organization, as many many people could testify, it's a path that happens.
Yeah.
So but that that doesn't help your starting situation very much. So,
Right.
yeah, I think there's so many things that they've got to do, and maybe bringing in a guy like Chaim Bloom makes the difference. What do you think about the influx of at least one top notch name that comes from someplace else?
I like it. I like it a lot. The Cardinals. You've talked about this a lot, Daniel. I'll give you a lot of credit here, and I've agreed with you from a distance, maybe even in person. The couple times that I've been on your show, but it's been a big topic of conversation for you for a long time. Is that need for outside voices that this it's a really good thing for an organization to promote from within and have some upward mobility internally. That's a good environment. Talented people want to stay there, want to work there. You've seen that with Gersh. You've seen it with Flores. I mean, these are guys that stick around because they have opportunities. But once you've done something a certain way and always done it that way, it might be a little difficult for you to see other ways to do it. And I think with their slow, progression towards analytics and lab work with their hitting and now their pitching, right? They still haven't built this mythical pitching lab in Jupiter. They're trying, but it's not there yet. And other organizations have had one for years. They're behind the curve a little bit. And so someone like Bloom does bring a different perspective, a different experience, a different mindset from a different type of organization, both in Boston and with the Rays. I mean, the Rays just operate completely differently. And so he brings that flavor and that uniqueness to a situation of talented people who maybe haven't been challenged in the ways that Bloom can challenge them. And I think pretty much only good things can come of that. At the same time, for the next 3 or 4 years, the players that are here and in the system are the players that are here and in the system. And maybe Bloom can do some things to help develop them, but his impact is likely not going to be truly felt until this draft class and the younger players down in the system or down in the complex working their way up. It's a long-term thing they're investing in, and the Cardinals are in their period of transition sort of now.
Yeah, it's not like he brought in one neat trick that can raise everybody's velocity 5 degrees, 5 mile per hour.
Right.
It's going to take some work, and he's got some. Excuse me. He's got some ways to make influxes, but he's also an advisor right now, right? I mean, he's not even going to be in St. Louis. I mean, that doesn't, in this day and age, obviously, as you and I are talking states apart, this is not a big deal, right? I mean,
right.
He doesn't have to be in the room where it happens, but but still, there is something to that of being in the day to day of being able to walk down to Mo's office and just, hey, let's talk about stuff or whatever the case may be, and sometimes ideas come around from that. So. I don't know. I think he's going to be somebody that's going to be very interesting to see. How often is he in St. Louis? How often are they talking about him?
Yeah.
How often does he get on? I mean, because we've seen the Cat interview Gersh and Flores and stuff like that. Is he going to get a couple of chances to interview Bloom this year? I mean, is that because I think if that's the case, they expect him to be part of this organization for some time to come. And if he's not, then maybe this is a little bit of a an experiment that they're not necessarily committed to yet.
Yeah. And I think in some ways, probably, I kind of neglected to say this before, but so I'll say it now. In some ways, we might kind of see the level of influence that he has in some of these like small sort of ancillary pickups. Like I think about like Nick Robertson, I like Nick Robertson a lot. I think it was a maybe less than what I wanted for Tyler O'Neill, but as a player, I'm pretty excited about him. So a player like that, a player like Fernandez, the Rule 5 pick, it's at these little side signings, if Bloom's influence is felt there and his approach is felt there, it can make a difference, but it's not gonna, it's not Robertson's not going to make the difference in this team winning the World Series and not this year, so it's going to be a while before his development and analytical skills really come into play in a big way.
I watch Robertson, lock down a win in the NLCS, and it's the key
prove me
win.
wrong, man. Prove me wrong. I'll take it. You know me, I love to be wrong on the internet. I'm perfectly fine with that.
Well, speaking of you being wrong,
Yeah.
no, it was an interesting thing. I was listening to the most recent roundtable podcast that y'all put out, and you didn't really get into it too much. You were talking about the pitching staff, but you said something that made me think. You said you didn't think there was any chance that Zach Thompson and Matthew Liberatore, neither one of them are on the roster come opening day. Now I've done two
That neither
roster
one are
make it.
on there. That one of them will be. Is that what you're saying? That I said?
You said one of them at least would be on the roster. Yes.
Yeah.
I've done a couple of roster mock-ups, and I'm
Yeah.
terrible at this, so it's fine. But I had them both in Memphis, basically being starting and being those depth guys.
Yeah.
So where do you think the value is for one of those guys to be the guy in the bullpen versus lengthening out in Memphis?
Okay. So I think that, well, first of all, let me just sort of preface this by saying that since we said that, Derek Gould has reported that the Cardinals are tossing around the idea of a 6-man rotation
Right.
to start the season. So that
Which does wrinkle. Yeah, that's a wrinkle.
yeah, that does. That if one of those two guys then has to be in the rotation, I could well, I mean that puts one of them on the team, doesn't it? So
Right.
So I guess that makes me right, Daniel, and you're wrong.
That's right. Which is probably what's going to happen. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, if that's the case, if they're concerned about innings early in the season or something happens in some regard, then I could see how they might want to have both players stretched out. But I personally think, based on what Mo has said at the end of the season and how he performed at the end of the season, that their preference would be for Liberatore to start in the bullpen. And I think they would like to keep him stretched out a little bit there. Like, I don't see them dropping him in as a 3-out 8th inning guy. I think they're hoping Romero can fit that role, but as a 1 to 3 inning guy in higher impact middle inning situations, like he's not Ponce de Leon, where it's just going to be relegated to mop up duty. But I think they want to keep him, as 1 inning plus. So they used him like that in the bullpen last year, but moving towards higher leverage, winning the game sort of situations. And because he performed well down the stretch in that, and because he hasn't performed really well in the bullpen, in the rotation, excuse me. I personally would like to see them give him a run where he just has success. Sometimes if you're in a role where you can have success, it helps you learn what you can do well and helps you figure out kind of how you get guys out. Because frankly, Liberatore hasn't gotten that many guys out in the rotation, that it could work backwards, that it could give him the confidence he needs to become a starter long term. But at this point in Liberatore's development, whatever works for him is fine. Whatever keeps him in the majors is fine. And so I personally think that the Cardinals would prefer if Liberatore was in a longer relief role with some possibility for impact innings, and Thompson was that guy that was ready to step in right away in a 6-starter role and is there, whenever there is an injury, because we know there will be one.
Yeah, I definitely think that, especially the way that he pitched down the stretch last year, that Thompson is going to be, in Memphis. Because he pitched so well as a starter in the major leagues, he's going to be at Memphis this year, right? I mean, that's
exactly
the way
right.
that it goes.
Yeah, there's a really good chance in my mind that Thompson's like our second or third best starter, but he'll be in Memphis. So
right. I agree with you on Liberatore if that's their thinking. I'd easily see that. I do wonder, and we've talked about this in years past as well, of that guy that we think is okay. We're going to have him. He's going to be that long man that pitch 2 or 3 innings. But then you get, again, they just restructured this rotation to make sure that everybody can go like 6, right? And then you're turning it over in theory to the Kitteridge and the Romeros and the Gallegos and stuff like that. And you run the risk, and we've seen this a number of times, of being that guy that doesn't pitch for 2 weeks because there's just not that situation. Now, again, that may be asking a lot of these guys, and there may be a lot of games where Lance Lynn would like to go 6, but he's going 3 because he's given up 6 runs or something like that. Yeah. But, and especially early on, maybe that's how they go about it. But I think that's my only hesitation with that, is we've seen that be a problem in the past.
Yeah. And I think that Liberatore helps in that because, Well, let's say, for example, that you get Lance Lynn and Kyle Gibson into the sixth inning, and then there's I can't think of who it might be off the top of my head, but you
Right.
got a run of two or three impact lefty hitters coming up soon.
Mhm.
Well, that's a great time to get them out of the game. Third time through the lineup, say they've got through five and a third, maybe right into six, something like that. And then you could just throw Liberatore out there because Liberatore can also get righties out. You could throw him out there for the sixth and seventh, and then let Gallegos, Helsley take the eighth, ninth, and it gives Kittredge a day off. It gives Middleton a day off. I think there's a role for a long relief lefty that might not be as easy to fill with a longer relief righty, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, especially with 3 batter minimums and stuff of that nature. That's, yeah. I mean, it very well might be, and I would not be stunned to see it to happen that way. And I think we've seen again with it's going to be very interesting this year, right? Because there's not anybody in this rotation that has the gravitas of an Adam Wainwright that you're not willing to take out with 4 2/3 in a key situation, so they can't get the win or something like that. Last year, obviously, you wanted Adam to get as many wins as possible to try to get to that 200th.
Yeah.
Before that, it was his career, and he was pitching well enough that you gave him the benefit of the doubt. But it feels like this year, all he's going to be able to, whether he will or not, he's going to have the opportunity to pull those guys quickly without worrying about the ramifications of, hey, I've just pulled out Miles Michaelis. Well, okay, it was Miles Michaelis, no big deal.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the case. And there will be times when Lynn and Gibson, assuming that they are kind of what we think they are, when they are going to be able to give you 6 or 7 innings and things work out for them. Even though they don't have great stuff still. I mean, Lynn still actually has pretty good stuff, but it depends on how well, he can limit home runs. Gibson, it comes and goes a little bit, but there'll be times where they have good games and they're able to save the bullpen and do that work that, frankly, Wainwright was only able to do, I think, once last year and get into the 6th or 7th inning. So that'll be helpful, and it'll help the bullpen, a very deep bullpen, work itself out a little bit more, and also give Marmol fewer needs to make choices. Like he'll just have to decide when he thinks the right time to pull these guys is, but he won't have to manipulate a bullpen for 6 innings almost every night, and that'll help the whole club.
Yeah, I think so. Lance Lynn gave up, I remember right, 44 home runs last year. Does he give up less than half of that this year? Because 22 is still a lot, but it's
22 is still a pretty good number. Let me pull up his stats here, which makes for great radio. Me pulling up the stat sheet on the internet.
Please hold while we connect you to our stat page.
How's your Friday going? Now here I've got it right here. I've got it right here. So his home run per 9. This is what I want to look at. Home run per fly ball rate is a rate that can be a little bit up and down a little bit. 19%. So 19% of the fly balls that Lance Lynn gave up left the ballpark. That's a high number. That's a very high number. But what is a low number is like 10. Half that. And so well, I guess what a great example is 2022. His home runs per 9 in 2022 was 1.41, nearly 1.5 innings per 9, or home runs per 9 innings. That is a total of 19 home runs in 122 innings. So that's one way of saying, it's a problem for him, and it has been a problem. So if he goes to 175 innings, I would expect him to have 25 or more home runs. But even 2022, despite that home run level, and this is where Lance Lynn can still provide some value, his ERA was 3.99, his fielding independent pitching, FIP, was 3.82, and his FWAR, wins above replacement, was nearly 2 in just 120 innings. So if he does that, even despite giving up 25 to 30 home runs, the rest of what he does is good enough that he would still be a pretty productive pitcher. And I think that's what the Cardinals are banking on. That Busch Stadium will limit some of that. He's going to give up his home runs, but the rest of what he does will be good enough for him to be a number 4 or number 5 starter.
I think that's right. And It's very interesting because I think what we've seen now is Lance Lynn, he limits the damage, right? He gives up home runs, but they're solo shots or whatever the case may be. I still
Yeah.
remember one of one a long time ago writing about Lance the Linning, as if you may remember that, where he always seemed to have one big inning in a
Oh
game
yeah.
where it just all blew apart. Um, I think he's kind of matured and learned from that. We don't see that as much, although last year it was just like all of his innings, I guess. But at least until he got to Los Angeles, he pitched pretty well for the Dodgers.
Yeah, well, he learned how to control his stuff, and he stopped walking guys as much.
Mm.
Like in the core years with the Cardinals, walk percentages were, that last year, 2017, for example, 10%. The year before that, 9%. Well, 2022 with the White Sox, 3.7%. The year before that, 7%. I mean, those are not quite Miles Mikolas level numbers. Well, the 3.7 is below, Mikolas, but Mikolas, excuse me. But much better than he was then. So he's not giving up a ton of hits and not walking a lot of guys. And then, like you said, giving up the 1 or 2 run home run, he can survive that because he can still generate Ks and still generate whiffs and still get guys out when he needs to.
We've seen batting practice, we've seen bullpens, things of that nature this week. As we get, I think it's a week from today, right, till our first game.
Is it?
Um,
Wow. Yeah.
I think it is. Maybe or I could be completely making it up, which is fine. Um, as we get into those games, who are you wanting to see? What are you wanting to see? I know the first couple weeks, of course, probably don't really care much about anything, but what are you wanting to see out of spring training?
Well, boy, I would like to say that I want to see our starting rotation do well, and I want to see Mason Wynn hit. But if I'll be really honest with you, what I'm really going to be looking for is how these sort of secondary starters and bullpen arms perform when they get their chance early in spring. Like I want to see where Gordon Graceffo is relative to last year, and I want to see Takoa Roby for the first time in a Cardinals uniform and get a measure of his stuff. I want to see what Simmer Bursa looks like now, because those are the guys. If we assume, and I don't want this to happen, and I certainly would be pleased if it doesn't, but if we assume that there is an injury or 2 or 3 in the rotation and in the bullpen, it's those arms that are going to have to step up and take a significant role. Zach Thompson matters, but whoever's below him in the rotation pecking order might end up mattering just as much, because they're likely to get 10, 15, maybe even 20 starts if there's, significant injuries. And so I really want to see kind of where those guys are, both for this season and for the future. And so I'll be keeping my eye on those players while I can, because as spring progresses, those guys will get less and less time. And so early on, that's what I'm going to be looking for. And then later in the season, I want to see where Miles Mikolas's velocity is and how many home runs Lance Lynn is giving up, and whether Gibson's sweeper, if he's still throwing it or whatever, it was just, or if it was just a little thing he was doing here and there, stuff like that. I'll start paying attention to those things. But for now, it's those younger guys that will receive most of my attention.
That is the good part of the early part of spring training, is you do see those guys that are, probably gone after the first or second round of cuts, but they do get some time. Especially last year with the World Baseball Classic, got plenty of time.
Yeah, that
Less
was
so
great in
this
some
year.
regard.
Yeah.
Yeah, it ended up not being great as far as the team went, because I think it did have an impact. But at the time, it was great. So
Yeah. Normally, I'd like to say I'd like to see them, at winning ball games, just because it feels like a good omen, and then not so much after last year. But
they should try losing in spring just
yeah,
to
let's lose
mix it
all
up.
the games.
Yeah,
Don't
lose all the games.
you know,
Really put
tied
that
in
theory to
the
the test.
yeah. And then they'll win 116, and it'd be great. I'm kind of interested to see these bullpen pieces, because I
Yeah,
think that the Cardinals, except for maybe John King, which I'm fine with John King as well, but I think they've collected such an interesting group of guys that I think it's just going to be interesting to see what they do, right? I mean, we've got a lot of apparently swing and miss and a lot of different ways they've gone
yeah.
about this. And so I'm just kind of curious to see what these guys look like, and if they're going to produce. Because, I mean, like you said, we've got 4 or 5 guys there at Memphis that can rotate out if necessary, assuming it's not somebody like Kittredge blowing up, then we got problems. But a lot of those guys have options still, and there's going to be a bit of a turn. So I think it's going to be fun to see what those guys bring to the table.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's some performances down there in the minor leagues that are really tempting. Like on our podcast, we talked about, I think it was Adam Akbani, one of our writers, brought up Riley O'Brien, and his K rate's almost 40%. I mean, it's crazy, so high. And here we are, we're looking at a guy like O'Brien, and we're like, what is he, like 10th in line?
Yeah,
because they've got their major league bullpen is really strong. I love Kittredge. I think Middleton's going to be solid, and Gallegos and Helsley are, in my opinion, two of the most consistent relievers in the game whenever they're on. So there's some names down there in the bottom and the back end of that I think are really exciting, and I think they could be. It wouldn't shock me at all, for example, if Nick Robertson and Riley O'Brien were holding down roles that we would normally assign to I don't even know, Andre Palante, and Ed King's a good example, or even Gallegos, or even Helsley at some point if there's an injury. These are guys that could really be dominant pitchers if they're able to put it all together.
Yeah, and we'll see. They will. I'm very, I don't want to say skeptical. I'm worried, hesitant maybe about Giovanni Gallegos. I don't think he's trending well. Last year they were saying it was a tipping the pitches, and he kind of figured it out before he went down with injury. Hopefully that's the case, but it just feels like to me that every year takes a little bit step farther away from the Gallegos that we remember. So
he's 32 now, and he's not a power guy. I mean, he's not a huge velocity guy, and his velocity has declined a little bit. So I can see that it's part of it, but he really wasn't that bad last year. I mean, honestly, he really wasn't. It just everything got amplified last year.
He always has seemed to me, and I'd have to look at it some. I have occasionally. It's just ridiculously streaky. He's going to have 7, 8, 9 games where he just shuts everything out, and then he's going to have 3 or 4 games where he gives up 3 runs each inning. I mean, that's just there's not a lot of in between with him. I don't feel like.
Yeah. I would have to look, and this is not the place to kind of do this kind of research, but
you don't think so? I mean,
no, it's really not. Yeah, for a 4-year period. Now 2020 cuts into that because it was such a small number of innings, but for a 4-year period, Gallegos had a 2.84 ERA, a 2.83 FIP, and a K per 9 of 11.2, with a walk per 9 of 2.2. You're going to be hard pressed to find any reliever in Cardinals history who was that good over 4 full seasons.
It is
difficult. And I understand what you're saying. I mean, I agree with you. I've lived it too, but that's just kind of the nature of relievers is 2 or 3 outings and then something bad happens. But you do that over the course of a season, and you're a really good pitcher,
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely fair that it's recency bias and all that kind of stuff as well.
Yeah, because last year he wasn't nearly as good. He was still good. He was still fine, but he wasn't that good. He wasn't, making you forget about Bruce Sutter kind of good. Bruce Sutter did a lot of other things that Gallegos can't do, obviously, but he's got numbers that fit with Isringhausen and Rosenthal and Lee Smith and others, even though he wasn't saving games. Well, that often. So
yeah, occasionally here and there, depending on not as much since Helsley's come into the picture, although Helsley has to stay healthy as well. So
yeah, right.
Lots of fun stuff. I've kept you long enough. I appreciate you joining me. What's coming up at Viva El Birdos over the next week or two?
Well, for me, not so much. I'm kind of taking a little bit of a step back to finish some things in my professional life. I've got a dissertation I've been working on for several years, and it's got to be done by April, Daniel. So that's all of my writing, all of my words are kind of going to that a little bit. But here in another week, the Viva El Birdos podcast is going to be starting our reunion tour. We think that this is the 20-year anniversary of Viva El Birdos, and so on our podcast, we're going to be bringing back old favorites, one of which you'll know in 2 weeks. Listeners here will know Alex Crisafulli, former Viva El Birdo, and John LaRue, one of our favorites, one of our great writers. John LaRue will be on with Alex and me, and probably Heather and a few of the other longer term writers. We'll be reminiscing about the good old days of Viva El Birdos and talking about where they are now and having a good fun together. So that'll be a great episode. We'll have a series of those throughout the whole year. So if you've read Viva El Birdos, which I'm sure most of your listeners have over the years, you'll see names that you recognize come through the podcast, and it should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, should be. Look forward to all those, and look forward to whatever shows up on the site, because it's, again, like you said, if it's been 20 years, and I feel like it probably has been, because this is my 16th, I think, maybe 17th this summer. So, and they were around before me. So that's got to be about right.
Yeah.
Then, and it's been the Cardinal blog that whole time. So it's very, very good. And everybody should be reading it as much as they possibly can. So
yeah, and actually read the articles. Actually read the articles, friends. Same thing with Derek Gould's and the Post-Dispatch stuff. Read the articles. That's where the real information is. X, Twitter, you just getting a little snapshot, fellas. You'll learn a lot more if you actually read what the article says.
Yeah, that's going to really get in the way of my takes, though, Jason. And I really can't.
I know it does for a lot of people. The whole 6-star thing was proof of that. That if you just read the article, you would have understood what Gould was talking about.
I don't feel like you even had to read the article. I didn't.
You really
I just read
didn't.
his tweet,
really
and it was like,
to.
okay, they're going to use us. They're going to. I think to some degree, if Derek had said, hey, they're going to use a spot starter for the first 2 weeks, that's different than saying they're looking at a 6-man rotation.
Yeah, sometimes we regret what we tweet, I think, and I think Derek might have regretted that one a little bit.
Nah, I doubt it. Nah.
Yeah.
He didn't give it another thought. He's like, these idiots, I don't care about them. So anyway, Jason, thanks again, and I look forward to doing it sometime in the future.
It's always great to be on, man.
Next week, we will have Josh Jacobs. He is writing at Redbird Rants and is doing the Newt News podcast. So look forward to having him on. But until then, for Jason, I'm Daniel. Good night.
In the air to right center. Back at the wall. It is off the base of the wall. The Cardinals are going to take the lead. Carpenter has emptied the bases, and with the 3-run double, St. Louis jumps.